Shalom Nikulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center here in Jerusalem. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another of our webinars. Those of you who are regulars to our English programming know that we have regular events both here at the center and also on Zoom for a virtual audience. As ever, I think we have people here in attendance both here in Israel and also the United States, the UK, and elsewhere. So welcome. We typically discuss here both contemporary Israeli Middle East issues and also Jewish history and other things pertinent to the Jewish world. And we have quite a lot of discussions with writers and thinkers who've produced new books and new items of interest, which we think will be influential in our time and maybe in the years to come as well. And it's really my great pleasure to have with us today Benjamin Kerstein, who's an award-winning Israeli-American writer. He's written for a number of Jewish publications and received the Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary from the American Jewish Press Association. He writes regularly at his Substack site, which is called No Delusions, No Despair. So you should check that out. And the book he has written, Self-Defense, A Jewish Manifesto, is, I think, a really pertinent piece for our time. And I wanted to talk to him about the impetus for writing it and the message in that book. And I'm going to have that discussion with Benjamin for 30, 40 minutes and then take questions from you, which you can write in the chat. So write them as they come up. You don't have to wait till the end. I will get to them subsequently. Benjamin Kerstein, welcome to the Begin Center Zoom program.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
So I've been reading the book over the last week or so. It's a great, concise read. I see it in a way as a kind of old-fashioned political, one of these kind of old-fashioned political pamphlets, these kind of book-length polemical pieces, a bit similar in a way to maybe to Barry Weiss's How to Fight Antisemitism, or if you want to go further back to The Jewish State by one Theodore Herzl.
Hey, it's a great compliment. Thank you.
But it has that sort of, it's written in that kind of, there's a sort of urgent style to it, which I think is really compelling and also speaks to the moment in many ways. So maybe we'll start just with a question about what the genesis of the book is, what prompted you to write it.
Well, what you just said is very gratifying because that's exactly what I wanted it to be, which was an urgent, concise expression of what I do see as a very pressing problem. I came to write it actually over a very long period of time. I have felt since really 2000, when the Second Intifada broke out, that there was a very precipitous rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, and that it was going to get considerably worse over time. Um, I was very, very unshocked by what happened on October 8th, 2023, when these massive crowds went out for their hate rallies to celebrate the October 7th massacre. And having talked about self-defense for many years, basically some people came to me in the publishing industry and said, well, maybe it's time you finally wrote a book about this subject that you've been talking about for so long. And that essentially was the genesis of the project, at least in terms of as an actual book.
Wow. Okay. And you say that you've been thinking about self-defense. You were thinking about self-defense for a while. That's specifically in the Jewish context,
Yes, yes.
because yeah, and I know you lived in Israel for 20 years or so before you relocated back to the States, and I think in a way, so much of it. I made that Jewish state comment at the beginning, but actually, and obviously, I'm speaking from the Begin Center, and
Mhm.
I was happy to see that near the end of the book, you got to Jabotinsky because there was a lot of Jabotinsky type language at the beginning. When you were talking about Jews unlearning what they'd learned, right? You talk you
Hmm.
there's this great expression that you had of learned helplessness,
Yes.
something this kind of the Jews had fallen into this sense of helplessness and victimhood, or weakness, if you like, physical weakness. And your argument throughout the book is that that's not there's an authentic counter narrative to that in Jewish history. Can you maybe say more about this learned helplessness and why it's not
Yeah.
necessarily authentic?
Well, learned helplessness is a psychological concept that was developed in the 1970s, and it involves some pretty cruel animal experiments in which a dog was placed basically in a cage and was subjected to electric shocks. And it couldn't escape from this cage. It was locked. And when the dog was placed in a cage where the door was unlocked and it could escape, it didn't escape. It just
Mm,
sat there and took the shocks. And so the theory that was developed from that was that the dog had essentially learned from its earlier experience that there was just no point. It had learned that it simply had to sit there and take it.
mm,
And so this came to be called learned helplessness. And yes, I think the Jews, over the course of centuries, when they had no political power, no military power, very little financial power, despite the exaggerations of anti-Semites, and so on and so forth, um, kind of to a certain extent had no choice but to sit there and take it, basically. And they developed various ways of dealing with that, such as developing this idea that they were more moral than non-Jews because they were willing to suffer for their faith and for their people, whereas, the non-Jews were not. Instead, non-Jews were doing all these horrible things to them. But what I admire about Jabotinsky and other Zionists, like, I quote Theodor Herzl and even Ahad, who
yeah,
was not a very militant Zionist, but was very, very radical in terms of his point of view towards these issues on a cultural level, was
yeah,
that no, this is no longer acceptable. In this new modern world, we don't have to be helpless. We can take our destiny into our own hands. And we can do that through fostering a new courage, a new defiance, a new sense of rebellion among Jews, and by ultimately building a Jewish state. But I think that a tragedy in a way, is that all of the great Zionists, for the most part, went to then Palestine,
mm,
and their legacy was lost in the diaspora.
mm,
Whereas I think people like Jabotinsky and Chadam have an enormous amount to say to the diaspora and still do.
mm,
And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to rediscover that and to convey it to hopefully a new generation of readers.
yeah.
I think,
It
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
go on.
No, I just think the diaspora has to relearn those lessons and
Right.
has to revitalize that legacy.
Right. And it's interesting. It's ironic in a way that because that what you're describing, that kind of passive, sort of morality is a kind of passive acceptance of suffering. Actually, sounds really Christian. That's that's the
Yes.
right. That's the irony.
Well, the writer
Like,
Eric
theologically.
Hoffer, the writer Eric Hoffer, who was not Jewish, he once wrote after the Six-Day War, he said, "It seems that the Jews are expected to be the only true Christians in the world."
It's
Uh, and
right.
it's absolutely dead right. And I think that especially through liberal Judaism and the Reform movement, which I don't want to just sit here and bash. I have my issues with it, but I don't. I'm not here to just bash it relentlessly. But I do think that one of the things it did was obviously to adopt certain aspects of German Protestantism, and I think
Mm,
along with that was to adopt that explicitly adopt that kind of Christian attitude of, if
mm,
someone slaps you on the cheek, just turn the other cheek. When I think that that is not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is also not to engage in wanton violence. That's not the Jewish way either, but certainly not to just sit there and take it. And I think
right.
certainly that's Jabotinsky's legacy. Certainly that's Menachem Begin's legacy.
Yeah.
But it's the legacy of all the great Zionists, to my mind, because they were all saying, no, we need to rise up against this. And the galut and the exile mentality is killing us
Right.
and will kill us. And of
Right.
course, as we all know, sadly, it did eventually kill an enormous number of Jews.
Yeah.
Um,
And the Zionist leaders, as you say, multiplicity of Zionist leaders looked back and harked back, as you do in the book, to biblical Israel, to the fighting Israel, the Maccabees, as the Jews as a warrior race in many
Mhm.
respects, a warrior nation, I should
And
say.
not just physical warriors, but also spiritual warriors. And I use the example of the prophet Elijah, who confronted the prophets of Baal and said, I am the only prophet of the Lord left, and the men of Baal are 450 men. So the courage that he displayed there, the rebellion against the many, the one
Mm,
against the many that he
mm,
displayed there, to me is an essential expression of Judaism, that the Jews said no to an idolatrous world. Everybody in the world at that point was essentially an idol worshiper, and the Jews were the only people who said, no, this is wrong. You're worshiping false gods. This is a lie. And we're not gonna conform with it, let's say. And then, of course, there is also the physical aspect where you have the great warriors like King David and King Sol. I don't know if Solomon fought a whole bunch of wars, but I'm sorry. But
yeah, but
you
right,
have
but
many
Saul,
warrior
Joshua,
kings.
right,
Yeah. And yes, the Zionists were acutely conscious of this and very deliberately went back to the Bible and seized on this in order to say, no, we haven't always been this passive, helpless people. We were kings and warriors in Israel and Judah when, Europe was a bunch of, mud-soaked villages. And they definitely seized upon that.
right, and I want to explore a little bit this spiritual self-defense thing because I think it's really interesting, and it's also less intuitive, I think, than maybe the physical side, which we'll also get to. But you mentioned Ahad Am earlier, who, of course, spiritual Zionism was his calling card in many respects.
Mhm.
And one thing you're very clear about at the beginning when you first bring up this issue is you're not talking necessarily about religiosity. You're not saying, okay, everyone needs to become like a religious Orthodox Jew. You're also not saying that. So maybe distinguish a little for us the spiritual self-defense from a sort of more kind of, I don't know, Orthodox understanding of
Right.
religiosity.
Well, I mean, Ahadam himself was not saying that one needed to
Right?
become Orthodox. What he was saying is that people need to reconnect with the uh, explosive spiritual forces at the heart of Judaism. That these intense forms of spiritual rebellion and of spiritual self-defense that the ancient Israelites had embraced, and even I think diaspora Jews had embraced,
Mm.
because one of the ways that the Jews, despite this aura of helplessness, one of the ways that the Jews rebelled and defied was simply to remain Jews, to
Yeah,
continue to be who they were in spite of everyone in the world trying to stop them from being it. And I mean, even to the point of abandoning Judaism. I mean, the crypto Jews of Spain and elsewhere were silently defying
yeah,
this kind of spiritual violence to which they were subjected. And that's what I think needs to be also reawakened today, because one of the things that anti-Semites are doing today, for example, to Jews on college campuses, especially to young Jews, is to beat them down spiritually, is to make them feel that they have no self-worth as Jews, and that and in this way, to force them to come over to the other side. They're saying that, no, if you join us in our war against your people, you will be valued, you will be loved, you will be a good person in our eyes. But if you don't do that, then you are at the lowest level of the sort of moral pyramid of the world. And that, I think, is what needs to be defied. You know,
right.
that and in some ways that has to come before physical self-defense, because what physical self-defense requires is a sense of defiance, a sense of integrity, a sense of self-respect that cannot be built without first defending oneself spiritually. And part of that involves doing what Elijah did, where, for example, if you're faced with a professor who says Israel is racist, apartheid, genocidal, and all the rest of it, Elijah would have stood up and said, that is a lie. You are a liar. And I do not have to listen to a word you say. And that's what we need to give young Jews the spiritual power in order to do that.
Yeah, I really like that the point you made about how the accusations leveled at Israel, we're almost it's almost sort of automatic that we start kind of defending. We start sort of getting into self defense mode and defending against
Mhm.
it. And the point you make, which I think is really excellent, is that I think you say that what is claimed by assertion can be refuted by assertion, right? So
Mhm.
it's not the points they're making are baseless, and it's just they're just stating, like, nonsense. and
Yes,
and there's no need to give it the kavod, to give it the any kind of
exactly.
credit by trying to
Well,
argue.
well, one of my mantras on my Substack is we do not have to listen to these people.
Right.
And one of the reasons is why do we accept the fact that these people have a moral right to make any argument whatsoever? Look at what they support. They support terrorism. They support mass murder. They support mass rape. They want to destroy an entire country. They
Mm,
despise an entire race of people. There is no conceivable reason why these people should be given any kind of a serious hearing.
right.
And I think the response to them should be to simply say that. And I've done this online, and trust me, their heads explode because they view themselves as a caste of saints. They believe
Right.
that they are the finest and most moral people who have ever existed in the entire history of the known universe. Now, that is laughable, but it's not an exaggeration. This is the extent of their spiritual arrogance. And like Elijah, what has to be done is to simply reject that, to simply
Mm,
say, no, I do not recognize your sainthood. I do not
mm,
recognize your right to make an argument. I do not recognize your right to assert some sort of moral superiority over me.
mm,
And, you know, you can simply say, well, if you don't recognize my right to exist as a Jew, as a Zionist, as an Israeli, or whatever, I do not recognize your right to make an argument.
mm.
I'm not sinking to your level, but I
Yeah.
certainly don't recognize your right to admonish me for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Treat it as the garbage that it is, and just reject it. Um,
Yes, yes,
um, I like that there's a sophistication also in when you're writing about the physical side of things, the physical self-defense. So one of the points you make is that many people might say, well, the way to deal with this is non-violent resistance. And rather than say, as maybe some others would, that non-violence is a non-starter because non-violence is always a non-starter. It's, there's no point in
mhm,
it. It's we should always be looking to take the fight
yeah.
to our opponents. Um, you make a much more nuanced point, which is that there is legitimacy in non-violence, and there is utility in non-violence in certain cases, but not in this case. Can you make a really clever, I think, distinction between the case
Yeah.
that the on the one hand, say, Martin Luther King on the one hand dealing with the United States and his opponents in the United States, and the people that we are dealing with.
Well, what it really comes down to, and the people who use nonviolence, like King, accepted this, um, that basically the only way that nonviolence works is essentially if you can shame the oppressor.
Mm,
In other words, through civil disobedience, you expose the oppressor's own oppression. You expose to them what they're actually doing. And as a result, the oppressor will change his ways. Now, the problem with that is you have to share a moral universe with the oppressor.
right.
The oppressor has to be willing to accept the same moral standards. And in King's case, they were really the standards of Protestant Christianity,
Mm,
because the United States is, obviously there's other religious minorities, but it's just in culture, it's a very Protestant nation. King was a Protestant preacher. He could appeal to those principles. He called himself an extremist for Jesus, so he could
right.
appeal to those principles to touch the conscience of the United States and did so extremely successfully.
Mm,
The problem with anti-Semitism is that it has no conscience. it's pure nihilism. It has no moral universe. And as a result, there is no way to appeal to any kind of shared moral universe. And
mm,
so, in that context, I would say that when it comes to self-defense, I prefer nonviolence. I lean towards nonviolence. But if there is a threat to you, either in body or your property or your loved ones, I do
mm,
think violence, hopefully legal and moral use of violence is entirely justified. And, that's the only response that will work against anti-Semitism because it
right.
responds to deterrence. It
Mm,
responds to the cultivation of fear in other people's hearts. That's what it tries to do, is instill fear in other people. And as a result, the only way to deal with it is to instill fear in the anti-Semite.
mm,
And regrettably, nonviolence isn't very effective in doing that.
right. Yeah, it brings to mind Gandhi's famous or maybe infamous suggestion to the Jews of Europe that they
Yeah,
that
God.
they uh, that they
Yeah.
that they they practice nonviolence against the Nazis. And as you say, it worked for Gandhi because, as with the United States, he was appealing to the British, right,
Yes.
who inhabited, as you said, that sort of Western Christian moral universe.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas the idea that the Jews could have appealed to the better angels of the Nazis' nature
Exactly.
is obviously lunacy.
Well, I mean, keep in mind too that the Nazis very consciously rejected the entire legacy of Western conscience. I mean,
Right.
I think Hitler said it very explicitly. I've come to destroy conscience, is
Yes, I
something
think
that he
he even said
said.
conscience is a Jewish invention.
Yeah, it's very possible. Yeah, he probably
Yeah, I
did.
think he said conscience is a Jewish invention.
Yeah.
Although I think he just thought everything bad was a Jewish
Yeah, pretty
was
much.
a
Pretty
Jewish
much.
invention. Um, but yeah, so let's talk a little bit about American Jewry specifically, because obviously
Yeah.
you're writing from the United States, and the American Jewish experience is really quite unique.
Hmm.
And American Jewry has had, has been, is in many respects still, stands alone in terms of its success and flourishing and acceptance in the wider culture and influence on the wider culture. And obviously, the size of American Jewry dwarfs all other diaspora communities that have ever been, in
Hmm.
fact. But something has happened in recent years. You said at the beginning about that you were concerned, several years ago about the rise of anti-Semitism. But do you think is there something that goes even further back? Because I know you're very critical in the book of the way that um, certain Jewish institutions or the Jewish establishment, if you like, have responded to things. What's your assessment of how things have gone in recent years with American Jewry?
I can tell you what I fear. What I fear is something like the expulsion from Spain, because Jews for several centuries had been an integral part of Spanish society, um, and probably thought that that would never really end. And in 1492, the last bastion of Islam falls in Spain. The Reconquista is completed,
Mm,
and within a year, every Jew in Spain had either been forcibly converted or expelled.
mm,
It happened almost literally overnight. So what that means is things can change like that. It can happen
yeah,
in an instant. And the idea that the United States is uniquely exceptional in that regard might be true. It's possible. But
mm,
all of Jewish history indicates that it isn't true.
mm,
And that not only can it happen here, it can happen anywhere. So I think the American Jewish illusion that it can't happen here is in some ways one of the most difficult impediments to active self-defense on the part of American Jews. They think America will protect them. Now, America might end up protecting them, but if you look at where American politics are going right now, I don't think that's in any way guaranteed.
right,
And by the way, I think things are going to get worse before they get better, if they get better. I think that American Jewish organizations have also suffered from this delusion. And again, my motto is no delusions, no despair. So I'm not trying to paint a totally apocalyptic picture here. But I think also there is an issue with two things with American Jewish organizations, and this is a bit of a separate subject, but essentially it comes down to the American Jewish community's class system, which no one likes to admit that such a class system exists in the Jewish community. But, well, you're British, so maybe it doesn't shock you as much. But obviously, it does exist. Every society has a class system. So the large establishment organizations are mainly made up of the Jewish elite and the Jewish upper class. And they live kind of in a bubble. They're insulated from the reality on the street, the reality on campus, the reality in certain cultural spaces where the Jews currently at the moment are being pushed out, persecuted and pushed out and marginalized. And so I don't think the problem seems as real to them or didn't seem as real to them as it did to a lot of the rest of us. It certainly did to me and a lot of other people I know who have been warning about this for 20 years and saying this is coming. And I
Mm.
think what happened was when October 8th, 2023 happened and the monsters emerged from their caverns and took to the streets to celebrate the slaughter of over 1,000 Jews. I think it was like a punch in the face to the major organizations, and it literally just knocked them out. And I don't think
Mm.
they've fully woken up yet. And if they have, they definitely don't know what to do about it yet. And that is an immense danger to the American Jewish community because it means there's no one to protect them at the moment.
Mm.
And that needs to change, precisely how it should change. Maybe the current leadership will wake up, possibly. Maybe they'll figure this out. Maybe they'll have to be replaced. Maybe new organizations will rise to take their place. I'm not exactly sure, but whatever solution is to be found, I think it needs to be found as quickly as possible.
You gave an example in the book of what you call the Battle of UCLA. Of the
Everybody has come at me with that
No, no,
question.
no.
Everybody.
I'm not. I'm not criticizing.
No, no,
I'm
no. I know, but everyone wants to ask about it. It's
yeah,
very
no. I'm
funny.
intrigued because no, because what you say about it is that what was important was that it was a case of American Jews defending themselves by
Hmm.
themselves,
Yes,
and there wasn't. They didn't look. They neither looked to America to save them, nor did they look to Jewish institutions to save them.
exactly.
They just took it upon
Exactly.
themselves to physically defend themselves
Hmm.
against an attack. You just briefly, for those people who aren't familiar with what happened at the University of California, Los Angeles, what
Yeah,
happened
so a bunch of anti-Israel fanatics, I like to use the term conquered and colonized a large section of the university, but basically they took it over illegally and squatted there, as they did on many campuses. And were attacking and harassing Jewish students and generally acting like they always do on all these campuses. And a very large group of young Jews got together, and I still don't know precisely who organized them. I don't know if anyone specifically organized them, but they went down there and they physically confronted these encampments. And there were some mistakes made. There were acts of physical violence that I would prefer had not happened, but nonetheless, it was a direct and very radical confrontation with the anti-Semites. And the main point for me is that the Jews won because the next day the university did what it had up to then refused to do, which that
it?
it cleaned out the criminals who had taken over the campus. And they have, as far as I know, never fully returned. So what happened at UCLA was that effective Jewish self-defense occurred. The Jews fought a battle that they won and proved that the Jews can win if they defend themselves. Now, I would prefer that they had done it in a slightly different way. I'd prefer that illegalities hadn't happened. I would have preferred that a more patient and perhaps less directly physical confrontation had occurred. Although I do think that if you're directly attacked, you do have a right to fight back. Nonetheless, it proves that this can work. And as a result, I think it should have been a model for campuses all over the country. And the great tragedy to me is that because there was illegal behavior there, it's probably why it didn't become a model.
Mm.
But I would like to see two, three, many better battles of UCLA, let's say.
Yeah, just on that illegality point,
Yeah.
it's interesting because when I first heard about the book, the first thing that came to my mind, the first question in my mind was, is he going? Is he moving? Is he recommending a kind of return to the JDL sort of thing?
Everybody
And,
asks that.
and then no, I'm sure. And then I was, and then and but I mean, I also I've read you enough to know that that was unlikely. And then
Mhm.
when I read it, you actually quite explicitly say that it's not, you're not advocating that at all. Can you say a little bit of why you're not advocating a return to, just for those on the
Mhm.
call that are familiar, the Jewish Defense League, the organization set up by Meir Kahane in the 1960s, I guess, uh,
Late 60s, early
uh,
70s.
before he moved to Israel, and obviously was, countering anti-Semitism, but did so in increasingly violent and criminal ways.
Yeah. Um, that's precisely the issue. The reason I reject it is first of all, let's put aside the moral issues of the kind of violence that they practice, which are obvious. You know, on a purely tactical level, the JDL was a disaster. It discredited Jewish self-defense for generations to this day. It
Mm,
was completely wiped out by law enforcement, and rightly so. And the truth is that the JDL gave the sword to its opponents that the opponents needed to destroy it. And so the JDL, in the end, was not effective. It didn't
mm,
succeed in its goal of effectively defending the American Jewish community and of fostering a culture of self-defense in the American Jewish community that would become, let's say, a permanent part of Jewish culture in the United States. So yes, I view it as very much a model to be avoided, and obviously I also just view Kahane and his methods as simply immoral. And when I say that, I mean contrary to Jewish morality. I don't like the way that he relentlessly went after other Jews. I don't like the fact that he used what I would call terroristic tactics. I don't like the fact that there were attacks on innocent people, things like that. But even putting that aside, I think it would be disastrous to form a new JDL, and this is why I want a self-defense organization, preferably a nationwide self-defense organization. But it has to be one that operates in a legal and a moral way, and I think that is eminently possible. I think you can build an effective defense organization that abides by the law and that abides by Jewish morality. And I think that one ought to be formed, as quickly as possible, as I said.
and how do you distinguish it from what already exists? For example, you mentioned the community security service,
Yes.
which I'm guessing is somewhat modeled on the British Community Security Trust, which is a British organization which has been in operation for much longer.
I
Uh,
think that's the model. Yeah.
yeah, but how is it distinctive from that? How is what you're advocating,
Mm.
which is, as you're very explicit in the book that you're advocating a mass movement,
Yeah.
mass nationwide movement. How is that distinct from what there already is?
Well, there's two reasons. One of them is simply that it would be nationwide,
Yeah,
and would be explicitly dedicated to defense, whereas CSS is really directly dedicated to security. And that brings us to the other issue, which is that um, the CSS and the other self-defense groups that I've encountered, and some of them are very good and doing very good work, are concentrated almost overwhelmingly on security at point of attack, protecting synagogues, protecting
yeah.
Jewish property, protecting Jewish events, Jewish schools, stuff like that. That's not good enough, in my view. What you need is a more proactive defense. They say the best defense is a good offense. You need, again, within the limits of law and morality, you need a more confrontational approach. You need a group that's going to go out and directly confront, a group that is going to directly gather information and keep track of anti-Semitic groups that are planning things like the siege of the Park East Synagogue the other day in New York City. You need a group that is going to train Jews in active self-defense. You need a group that is going to have an army of lawyers to deal with, the inevitable attempts by our enemies to use lawfare against us. But I think the main issue is that, Israel has a concept of, for example, of rings of security, only one of which is security at point of attack.
Right.
There are many other layers of ensuring security, including preempting attacks before they occur and things like that. And I think it should be done in coordination as much as possible with law enforcement. depending on how willing law enforcement is to cooperate. In certain areas, they're very willing. In certain areas, they're not. I presume in New
Yeah.
York City, very soon they won't be, but that's another question.
Well, yeah, we'll get there. We'll get
Yeah, we'll get
there.
there. But that to me is the main difference. It has to be more than security at point of attack.
Right. Okay, that certainly makes sense. And do you see any allies in other sectors in American society? I mean, non-Jewish, the non-Jewish America, because obviously, in the Israeli context, we're used to, especially in recent years, we're used to thinking about Christian Zionists, for example, as strong supporters of Israel outside of the Jewish community. Do you see non-Jewish allies in this, or is this or should this be very much a Jewish only enterprise?
I regret to say that I think there will be individual allies who come forward, but I don't think any single community will come forward to ally themselves with us. I think that this is going to have to be a Jewish fight. I do think that as the Jews defend themselves, that more and more allies will emerge. I think that the spectacle of the Jews standing up for themselves is going to motivate non-Jews to stand up for the Jews as well. Because,
Mm.
as they say, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Well, if you are for yourself, people will be for you, in my view. And especially in America, America admires people who fight back. America admires rebels. It was born in a rebellion. America admires people who defend themselves, for the most part.
And
And
Israel, I think there's
yes,
a
and
reason why
Israel.
Israel has been popular among Americans in a way that it hasn't been popular among with many other populations, with many other national
Yes,
populations.
yes.
So let's go to the the socialist elephant in the room. The 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 we I mean I feel like things are changing so much, in Israel and the Jewish world over the last 2 years since October 7th, that at any point that you do an event, something will have happened in the last 2, 3 weeks which
Of course.
changes slightly the direction of the conversation. And obviously the election of Zoran Mamdani as mayor of New York is potentially a real hinge moment. So,
Mhm.
what was kind of your initial reaction to that, and how does it play into your thesis?
My first reaction to it was, again, being distinctly unshocked.
Mm,
I thought from the beginning that he was going to win. There's a lot of votes in hating the Jews and a lot of votes in hating Israel. Um, I knew that all the people who took to the streets to celebrate October 7th were voting Mamdani. All the people in the universities who did the same, and the people who let them get away with it were voting for Mamdani. Large amounts of the young people who live on social media and just buy anything that shows on it were voting for him.
mm,
Large portions of people would vote for him for economic reasons. So his election, did not surprise me. But I think that it is a hinge moment in the politics of the American left. It's a hinge moment, possibly in the history of the Democratic Party, because what it proves is that anti-Semitism is no longer disqualifying.
mm.
It proves that you can hate Israel and hate the Jews and get away with it in
In
American
the most
electoral,
Jewish city in America.
in the most Jewish city in America. So that to me is several things. It's proof, first of all, of the impotence of the Jewish wing of the Democratic Party. It's evidence of the extraordinary level of the betrayal that the Democratic Party has now visited upon its Jewish constituents, upon a group of its most loyal voters, which is utterly disgusting and disgraceful. But it also marks a point of potentially existential danger for the Jews of New York City, which is one of the greatest diaspora communities that has ever existed. It's up there with the Jews of Alexandria and the Jews of Vienna and the Jews of Cordoba as one of the great diaspora communities in history. And I think that as things get worse, and they will get worse, as Mamdani um, gives a wink and a nod to the anti-Semites in the street as he starts to deter the NYPD from dealing actively with anti-Semites and anti-Semitic incidents. He'll use salami tactics. He won't go all out and say, try to pass a law expelling the Jews,
Sure.
but he'll go step by step, a plan of stages, as it gets worse, a lot of Jews are going to flee, but a lot of Jews are going to stay and fight. And it worries me very much how they're going to fight. And I wrote very controversially on Twitter or X a couple of days ago, if you insist on Mamdani, you will get Kahane. By which I mean, if you leave the Jews no way out, if you give them no path towards legal and moral self-defense, which currently does not exist,
Mm,
you will end up with at least some Jews embracing immoral and illegal self-defense. And that, I think, would be very, very bad for New York and very, very bad for the Jews because you're going to end up with another JDL and you're going to end up with another disaster like the JDL turned out to be. And
mm.
a lot of people are going to get hurt. And
Interesting.
um, and I think that that is why it is one of our great tasks, both the grassroots, the Jewish grassroots, and hopefully the establishment Jewish leadership, is to somehow create that path towards legal and moral self-defense for the Jews of New York and Jews in the United States in general. Because Mamdani is not going to be the last of these kinds of people who's going to rise to power. I can assure you of that.
Right. Yeah, there is the very real risk that he's going to be a model for the Democratic Party going forward, at least for
Exactly.
in certain parts of the party. Okay, I want to go to questions that have been put in the chat. Keep writing them in. David Loeb asks, he says, let's say you're a student in a prestigious college, you want to go to a graduate school where your GPA matters. Your professor says something anti-Semitic. What are the possibilities someone will risk their academic standing to argue with a professor who likely will only punish you? Like, I guess how
Yeah.
do you deal with the anti
Uh,
professor?
at the moment, I'm sad to say very low.
Right.
But this is because of a certain mentality that has been bashed into the heads of young Jews for generations, which is that you have to do everything possible to remain upper middle class.
Hmm.
And in order to do so, you need a college degree and a graduate degree.
Hmm.
And as a result, I think everything has been sublimated to the need for that kind of upward mobility, or at the very least, maintaining one's class status. And what I think the Jewish upper middle class has forgotten is that the Jews have no middle class. They can't have a middle class because the middle class can always decide that they're Jews. So this is a delusion that they
Hmm.
have. And I think that this is something that American parents, as part of the spiritual self-defense, need to tell their kids. If you encounter anti-Semitism from anybody, students, professors, administration, whatever, and you fight back, we will back you up 100%. We don't care if your GPA gets damaged. We don't care if you don't get into a graduate school. We don't care if you don't end up having three cars and a giant house in Teaneck. Like it doesn't matter to us. It's more important that you retain your dignity and that you maintain your self-respect and that you stand up for your people. That's what I think really needs to happen. Because the truth is, the Jews are all in it together, whether we like it or not. I mean, yes, we do have a class system, but to non-Jews, it's totally irrelevant. So I think that above all is what we need to remember when it comes to these things. So yes, the Jew should stand up and say to the professor, you're a liar, and you are not someone that I need to listen to,
Hmm.
and throw it right back in their face. Yeah.
Right. You joked earlier that I understand class because I'm British, but I think yeah, I learned in our conversation off camera beforehand that your mother's British. So I think
Yes.
that I think like Jewishness, Britishness goes through the mother. So you're also British. That's my explanation of your
That
understanding of your understanding of this. Um, so Stan Slater, interesting question. What do you think of Jews carrying guns?
I think Jews carrying guns is a good thing. I don't think it's going, I think that, well, I have two issues with it. One is that it's not going to solve the problem in and of itself. In other words, what's an individual Jew with a gun really going to do to solve the meta problem that we're facing? We need an organization for that, not just people buying guns. The second thing is that American gun culture has problems with it that the Jews should not fall into.
Hmm.
Now, I was raised by a father who served in the military. My uncle also served in the military. It was drilled into my head at a very early age that guns are not toys, that you have to respect them, that you have to take care of them. That you, for example, should never point even an empty gun at another person, things like this. Now, I think most American gun owners feel the same way, but there's a minority that don't and do believe that guns are toys and are very reckless and irresponsible with them. And I would hate for Jews who are buying guns for the first time to fall into that kind of mentality. Those are my two issues with it. But I think on the whole, if you train properly in the use of weapons and things like that, then it's a good thing. Being able to defend yourself, whether through Krav Maga or other martial arts or through owning a weapon, yeah, that's perfectly commendable. Just know how to do it. Don't be reckless
Right,
about it.
right, right. Um, Stacey Harrell has a question from the on the Mamdani point. If you can address the Jewish people who voted for Mamdani, that
Yeah,
there seem to be a lot of them.
that's the question I always get. Well, first of all, there are fewer of them than people like to say. Cuomo got about 70% of the Jewish vote. Now, in America, that's what's called an overwhelming landslide. Most American elections are decided by about 55% of the vote or less. Um, that 30%, though, is larger than it should be, and it's worrisome. My guess is that, again, this is a class issue. My guess is that most of the Jews who voted for Mamdani are privileged, upper middle class, university educated, largely if largely secular, if not entirely, the type of people who hold Buddhist seders, and I'm not necessarily knocking you if you hold a Buddhist Seder, but it is a kind of statement of intent among some people. And I think that it is not surprising to me that those people have become alienated from the rest of the Jewish community and that they've become alienated from Israel because both of those represent a type of Judaism that they've largely rejected in favor of other things, and they don't view themselves as being subject to the same fate as other Jews. Now, they're wrong.
Mm,
They're completely wrong. And to me, it's scary because they remind me of some of the very assimilated Jews of Weimar Germany who thought for a long time, well, we're not the target of the anti-Semites because we're not like that. We're not walking around in a stramal and a beard and all the rest of it. We're Germans who, happen to be of Jewish ancestry. Um, I don't like using parallels like that, but you fall into it inevitably.
mm,
So I think that's where the Jewish Mamdani vote came from. Yeah. And I think I'm borne out by that because everyone I've seen in the media who's writing defending those Jews who voted for Mamdani are exactly the type of Jews I'm talking about. Whether it's Ezra Klein or somebody else, I mean, I think it's at the New York Times and so on. So
yeah.
that's my take on it. And by the way, I'm not saying that to say we should throw these people in the garbage. We need to reach out to them. We need to say to them, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to go down this path, which is only going to lead to your degradation and destruction. We need to be compassionate towards them. Um,
Would you make a distinction? Because that's an interesting question. Would you sort of divide those Jews into sort of the kind of true believers,
uh,
the sort of anti-Zionist true believers who fully signed up to the idea
yeah,
that in order to be accept, they basically ditched Zionism for sure, and maybe even
yeah.
lost off their Jewish identity in order to be in with the progressives,
My,
and others that are just kind of scared or unsure, or I don't know
yeah.
how you would make
Well,
that
I mean, there's those
division.
Jews who just really don't care and were like, oh, I like Mamdani because he's a socialist and I voted
Right,
for him. I think that's the majority of
right.
the Jewish vote for Mamdani. There is a minority that has gone over to the other side, and in my view, to put it in blunt terms, sold their soul to the devil.
Mm,
Um, I have two contradictory thoughts about them. Uh, One of them is that my litmus test for anti-Semitism is very simple, which is someone okay with killing Jews? If they're okay with killing Jews, they're an anti-Semite. It's that simple, you know. There are some Jews who have gone so far into the anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas rabbit hole that they are okay with killing Jews. Um, those people are irredeemable. There is no way to get them back, nor should we try to get them back. There are other Jews who have bought into the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas deal who are more like people who are in a cult.
Mm.
And people can be gotten out of cults. It's a
Yeah.
long, difficult
Deprogramming.
process. Deprogramming. It's a long, difficult process. It involves a lot of patience. It involves a lot of disappointments and obstacles along the way. But it can be done, and I think we should be trying to do it. But there are those who are simply not redeemable. I think, for example, Bernie Sanders is probably the most prominent of them.
Mm.
Bernie Sanders is an irredeemable man, in my view. That may be controversial to say among some, but I just don't see it. I don't see any way he gets out of the hole that he's dug for himself, you know.
Right.
When you refuse to meet hostage families, you know, then
Yeah.
you're gone.
Right.
It's over. So,
Right. And for
um,
him, it's been a very long time. I mean,
yeah.
it's been he's been sort of marinating in that world for such a long time.
And he's enabled the political rise of an enormous number of anti-Semites. So,
Yeah.
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 Anyway, I don't want to get bogged down in Bernie
Sure.
Sanders,
Sure. God forbid. Um, there's a question here from David Loeb about your view of the ADL, whether they're doing. He says, is ADL doing what you suggest American Jews do? For example, they keep track of anti-Semitic incidents and educate, etc.
No, they are not doing what I think American Jews should do.
Okay.
Um, I'm not sure how far I can elaborate on that, but what they're
Well,
not, they're,
what do you think of their efforts in monitoring anti-Semitic incidents and, as David says, educating about anti-Semitism and the dangers of anti-Semitism?
woefully inadequate, an excuse for not taking a more aggressive stance, fear of alienating constituencies that have already abandoned the Jews, fear of losing allies who are already gone.
Mm,
I think that the ADL, does some good things, but their job, they ultimately have one job, which is to protect the American Jewish community from anti-Semitism. And I can tell you right now, from speaking with numerous Jews, and not just since I published my book, but for years, American Jews do not feel protected. They do not feel defended. They do not feel that they have someone powerful on their side. And the ADL is the one that should be doing that. And they're not
right.
doing it at the moment. And we already spoke about the failure of the American Jewish establishment. Now, the JDL
Mm,
should monitor anti-Semitism and educate about anti-Semitism, but they need to do a lot more if they're going to be effective at what, again, is their one job, their only real reason for existence.
mm,
That's my view. I'm sorry to be so harsh about it, but makes
right.
me a little mad.
Fair enough. No, I mean this is one of the, as I said, one of the I think one of the compelling elements of your book is that there's a controlled fury in there, which
Yeah.
I think is
And by the way, they can change, I think, if they want
okay.
to change and if they're willing to change. I don't know if they are. We'll see. We'll
Hmm.
see.
Okay. Um, so Eric Pastman asks, at what point do you think it is time for Jews to leave? I assume he means to Israel.
Yeah.
He can write in if you think if that's wrong. And also he adds yes. He says yes.
Yeah.
He says, and has Europe already reached that point in your view?
The answer to the second question is yes. And I've heard this. I was heartbroken to read after the Manchester synagogue attack. It was Manchester, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, someone was one of the synagogue members was quoted saying, "It's the end of Jewish life in Britain. It's over." And that broke my heart because of my own British ancestry. And yeah, I think that the time in Europe has come for mass aliyah. In the United States, the moment will be when an anti-Semite is elected president, God forbid. But if, for example, AOC is elected president, that's the moment to leave.
Or Tucker Carlson
Or Tucker
on the other
Carlson.
side.
Oh,
I
they're
mean,
on the right too.
we
Yeah, or
haven't
Tucker
talked about it
Carlson.
because of the understandable focus of your book because of the Israel is the left, but
Yeah.
obviously we're now dealing with something new on the right in the last
Yes.
month as
Yeah,
well.
and we should have touched on that. It is important. But yeah, if Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes is elected president or AOC is elected president, don't be the Jew who didn't get out in time.
Hmm.
I by the way, I don't think a second Holocaust is in the offing in the United States,
Sure,
but something very bad will be in the offing if that happens. And it's better to get out before it happens, in my view.
sure.
Hopefully it won't come to that.
Um, okay, let me. We're going to finish. I have one last question, which is,
Mm,
what's the reception been from and from the Jewish establishment that you're pretty critical of, but also
right.
from I know Jewish students. I'm thinking of we haven't mentioned it, but or maybe we referred to them maybe implicitly, but there are Jewish student groups that are really doing very, I think,
Oh, yes, wonderful things.
praiseworthy stuff. Students supporting Israel, which is an organization that I've worked with before, who
Yeah,
do
just,
great
just
stuff.
just to be clear, I'm not bashing the smaller groups. Some of them are
No, no,
doing
no, sure,
amazing work, and have amazing people in them. So
yeah,
just to make that clear.
yeah. But so, what's the reception been from sort of wider Jewish America?
I have found that among individual Jews, especially young Jews, the response has been very positive.
Hmm.
Among Jews online, the response has been very positive. In the podcast world, the response has been very positive. I was at a conference a couple of months ago where the audience really embraced the book, and we sold out all our copies, and I was signing copies for people, and they're asking me. So clearly, there's an enthusiasm there among a lot of people. The From the major organizations, the response has been total silence. They just don't seem
Hmm.
to realize that it exists. I've had some problems with synagogues and schools and other institutions who I've inquired about maybe coming to have me speak or something like that. For the most part, from them, I also get silence or a very polite, "Thank you very much, good luck, but we're not, interested at the moment." And But the book is doing fairly well in terms of sales. Not, it's not a number one bestseller, but it's hanging in there. And so I would say that's been a positive. On the whole, the reception has been positive. I wish that some of the larger and more powerful institutions in Jewish life were more willing to embrace it. But I kind of expected that they wouldn't, at least at first. The book was written to an extent to create controversy, and people shy away from controversy many times, so
Yeah, yeah. That's certainly the case, unfortunately, with too many establishment figures
yes.
and institutions.
Yeah.
Um,
But again, they can change.
they can change. The door is open. Um,
Exactly.
okay, so firstly, for those of you who are watching this live on Zoom, I've written in the chat my email address and also the link to Benjamin Kerstein's Substack. So you should definitely check out his Substack. Email me if you want to be on our mailing list and you're not on our mailing list for English events. You'll get one or two emails a week from me with details about what we have for English speakers in person and on Zoom. And you should definitely head over to Amazon or a good local bookstore and buy Benjamin Kerstein's fabulous book, Self-Defense and Jewish Manifesto. It has a lot, I think, to inspire and teach us all, and is, as I said at the beginning, extremely and perhaps tragically pertinent to our times. But thank you, Benjamin, so much for your time.
Thank
Um,
you. It's a great
thank
privilege.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. On Sunday, we have an event live here at the Begin Center looking back to the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution at the UN, 50 years since that moment, which has influenced a lot of what we're dealing with now, actually, in many ways. And that will also be on Zoom for those of you not in Israel. So you can head over to our website or Facebook page or email me the details of that. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Have a great day.